Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Never Mind the Dambusters, the podcast that explores the history, people, and often controversial legacy of RAF Bomber Command. I'm Jane Gulliford-Lowes.
And I'm James Jefferies, and it's great to have you with us again.
Now, before we introduce today's guest, James, how have things been since we last sat down behind the microphones, which I think was, only about a week ago?
Yeah.
Have you been doing anything more interesting or any more exciting new research for the PhD?
Similar things, yeah, PhD, just planning the next chapter, which I did. I submitted the Battle of Britain one previously, and I'm now back with the Bomber Command chapter. So, yeah, lots of work with that. I've also, one of the biggest things I've been working on is the summer course at Cambridge. I'm just finalising that because I'm adding a lot of espionage to it. So I'm having to do a lot of extra reading.
Espionage at Cambridge, of course you are.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I know. So, yeah, I've been coming up with like decoding games and stuff for the students and, trying to build on some of the...
Your week sounds infinitely more interesting than my week has been, that's for sure. I've spent 2 days in the tax tribunal in my real job, which was not exciting whatsoever. Anyway, so I've been doing rather a lot of thinking about 10 Squadron recently, and as everyone will expect, that's nothing unusual. Regular listeners will know that 10 Squadron has become something of a recurring theme on the podcast, not least because of my own research into that squadron and also writing for Above Us the Stars, which of course features a 10 Squadron crew and my uncle. Every time I think I've exhausted this squadron's stories, another extraordinary one seems to emerge.
And today's story certainly falls into that category. It begins as the story of a Bomber Command airman, but it becomes something much bigger than that.
Exactly. Now, today's guest is someone who will be very familiar to our listeners. Sean Feast joined us in Series 4 to discuss the raid on Peenemünde and the vital role played by the Master Bombers, an episode that prompted a fantastic response from our listeners. Now, Sean began his career as a journalist before becoming one of Britain's leading aviation historians and authors. He's written more than 20 books covering Bomber Command, the Pathfinder Force and the Royal Air Force, and his meticulous research has brought countless individual stories to light. He's back with us today to discuss his remarkable new book, which tells the extraordinary story of Stanley Booker, a 10 Squadron navigator whose wartime experiences stretched far beyond operational flying. Shot down just before D-Day, Stanley endured Gestapo interrogation, imprisonment, deportation to Buchenwald Concentration Camp as one of the so-called terror flyers, post-war service during the Berlin airlift, intelligence work during the Cold War, and then spent decades fighting simply to have his story believed. Sean, it's a real pleasure to welcome you back to Never Mind the Dambusters.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me back.
Now, Sean, you've written many books about many remarkable individuals over the years, but Stanley Booker's story is extraordinary, even by those standards. How did you first come across Stanley, and what made you realise his life deserved a full biography? And what was it like working with someone who was still determined to seek recognition for what had happened to him more than 80 years after the war?
Yeah, well, I first came across the story because I'd written a book 10, 12 years ago called The Last of the 39ers, which was about a chap called Alfie Fripp, who had been shot down, not surprisingly, in 1939. And a lady called Pat Vinicum, who is Stanley's daughter, had a copy of the book and enjoyed reading it and contacted my publisher, John Davis, at Grub Street and asked to be connected. And so I spoke to Pat, and it was pretty obvious straight away that her father had an incredible story, and he was still alive as well. So that was very much a plus today. And so I journeyed down to go and see her down in Dorset. And as soon as we chatted and she told me more, I just knew this was a story that needed to be told. And Pat won't mind me saying this, there was this moment where we went into her study, and I kid you not, it was floor to ceiling by way of documents, research, and material that she had accumulated and that her father had accumulated over the last sort of 40, 50 years or so. And it was like, for an author, you know what it's like. It's like a treasure trove. You're walking into something which is almost too good to be true. But in this case, it was actually true. So listening to that story, it made me realize that a full biography, a full story was worth looking into. I've had the privilege of meeting many, many dozens, many hundreds of veterans over the last 30 years, but there was something about this that was just truly exceptional. The fact that he'd been an airman, then he'd been a prisoner, then, as I say, a saviour, which we'll come to, and then the spy. It had everything you could possibly be looking for as an author for a story. As regards what it was like working with, I mean, it was just a fantastic experience working with Stanley, with Pat. Pat was the main sort of conduit through to Stanley, obviously, but I did get to meet him and was able to fire questions at him. And he was always assiduous in coming back to me with copious amounts of detail. So phenomenal memory. And as I say, a phenomenal resource to draw upon in the first place. And what really got me was his passion and drive to right a wrong. And that was totally undiminished, sort of even 80 years after the event.
Mm-hmm. Before his capture, Stanley was a very young Bomber Command navigator with 10 Squadron. Could you tell us about his early RAF career, his operational tour during 1944, and also perhaps paint a picture of what life would have been like for a young navigator joining one of Bomber Command's most experienced squadrons at that stage of the war?
Yeah, sure. So he was born down in Gillingham, and as a child, he'd obsessed over the military and watching the ships come and go from Chatham dockyards, etc. So he was a classic little boy of his time and loved flying machines and the like. And so actually he decided upon joining the Royal Air Force as an apprentice, but rather than a sort of Halton apprentice, he was an apprentice in terms of the administrative branch. So sort of all the secretarial work, the people that keep things going. And then before the war, or just as the war broke out, he joined one of the auxiliary squadrons, number 613, who had just come back from France. And they were flying an eclectic mix of aeroplanes. I mean, things like Hawker Hectors. I mean, aircraft that you just don't come across. Yeah, it was brilliant. And so he's with these sort of weekend flyers, as it were. And he always told this very funny story about the fact that the CO was a regular and Stanley was a regular. And he literally turned around to Stanley one day and sort of, he was just a mere humble sort of AC2 or something, and said, you know what, we're the only two regulars. You're the only one I can really trust on this squadron, which I thought was a great little story. So Stanley sort of, badgered his CO and one or two of the other pilots to fly. He managed to go up quite a bit in a Lysander, for example. He learns a bit of air gunnery. This is all sort of off the books type work is the best way of describing this. But it made him even more determined to become aircrew. And when his age finally allowed, he volunteered for training as a navigator. And he was quite lucky. He sort of used his connections and knowledge not to have to go overseas to train, but actually join one of the few air observer schools that was in the UK. So actually, he did all of his training here in the UK. And he qualified, and he went to OTU, formed the crew, then went on to HCU, and then on to 10 Squadron. And I can tell you, and Jane will absolutely love this, that he was super excited about joining 10 Squadron because he knew, okay, they weren't Pathfinders, in fairness, but he did know that they were elite. As far as he was concerned, this was one of the top squadrons to join in Bomber Command. Fantastic history, fantastic pedigree in terms of former COs. I mean, obviously, I know a fair amount about 10 Squadron because of Donald Bennett, and that's a particular Pathfinder's particular passion of mine. So he was really excited. So in terms of other people of his age, they would have been super excited about going onto a squadron. This is all about this time. You've gone through all of that training, and now you want to put that training into practice. And by way of context, we're now sort of in March 1944. So we're just coming to the tail end of the Battle of Berlin and the disastrous raid on Nuremberg. Coming into April, there's a little bit of a reset going on in Bomber Command. So it's sort of a good time to join because we're now pre-invasion. So the targets are very much pre-invasion targets, the marshalling yards, coastal defenses, radar installations, that sort of thing. Yes, they're also continuing some of the raids on the main cities as well. But I mean, he gets off to quite an exciting start, actually, because on one of his very early trips to Hasselt, on the 12th, 13th of May, their aircraft gets hit from bombs from above, which, as you will know, some of our listeners may or may not know. I mean, it wasn't typical, but it wasn't so uncommon as to be unheard of. It did happen. And they actually lost 2 engines and managed to get back on 2 engines. And what was interesting there was it really focused their minds in terms of training on the ground as the quickest way to evacuate the aircraft. So they practiced and practiced and practiced by way of managing, bailing out safely. And that was rather important, as we will come to see, because it was on an attack on a marshalling yards at Trapp that it all went spectacularly wrong.
That's so interesting, Sean, particularly the time scale. My uncle and his crew completed their tour at 10 Squadron on the 7th of March, 1944.
Oh, brilliant. Wow.
Yeah. So they must have just been finishing as Stanley was starting.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's... Yeah,
they would have
amazing.
crossed over because I think Stanley arrived from memory. It's something like the 18th of February. The crew actually arrived, but then didn't start operating until several weeks later. Yeah.
So he will have been flying the Mark III Halifaxes, because I think
correct.
The squadron got their first Mark III on the 7th of March. So, yeah,
absolutely. Yep.
Lucky for him. Yeah. My uncle and his crew never got to fly the Mark III. They were on the old Mark IIs, which was an adventure in itself. So, Stanley's aircraft was shot down just before D-Day, but for him that was really only the beginning of his ordeal. Can you talk us through the circumstances of his loss, his attempts to evade capture, his betrayal to the Gestapo, and the brutal treatment he received during interrogation? I can't even say that. Is it Fresnes? Fresnes Prison?
I think it's Fresnes.
Yep. Fresnes. Yeah. See, I'm pronouncing that like a Norwegian rather than a
I've been consulting my future daughter-in-law as she is French on some of these pronunciations. Yeah, so he was. They were attacked by a night fighter. So with the night of the 2nd, 3rd of June, 1944. The night fighter hit them. They were in a bit of a state, and the aircraft returned and made a second pass. And on that second pass, it killed the pilot and the wireless operator. At that stage, the pilot, Sandy Murray, given the order to bail out. So everyone's making for the emergency exits and bailing out. And the other 5 actually do manage to get out of the aircraft, which is quite some feat in its own right. Bailing out of any aircraft is difficult enough, but when something's sort of on fire and tumbling to earth, it adds another level of challenge. I think this is where the practice that they put in, so much practice into getting out of that aircraft, I think undoubtedly that saved their lives. So Stanley came down, did the usual, buried his chute, tried to remember the training that he'd actually been given in escape and evasion exercises and the various lectures about what to do and find yourself a vicar and all those good things. Now, he actually spoke to a farmer and the following morning, or when it was daybreak, and the farmer pointed him to this house. Now, this is slightly comic because he pointed him to this house because he said there's an Englishwoman lives there. So an Englishwoman living in France who had not been interned. And she was called Madame Lefebvre. And she lived in a big castle or a chateau. And he made his way there. And sure enough, he was welcomed with open arms. Now, I use that term advisedly because obviously she was very suspicious at first. It could have easily been a plant, all of those sort of good things. But to say Stanley had lucked out would be the understatement of the decade, because this place was safe in the sense that it was off the beaten track. The food was fabulous. They had champagne. I mean, he really did luck out. So he was quite happy for a time. There was very shortly after arrival a visit by the local resistance, a mysterious man called Francis Dablin, and he had a code name and what have you. And he was the wireless operator, the local sort of resistance wireless operator. And he and another came in, at gunpoint, guns waving, and interrogated him a little bit, and then verified his identity and came back subsequently with identity papers. So Stanley is Pierre Leconte. He is now a gardener. He's given the necessary clothes to make him look like a gardener, and he's basically sitting tight until such time as he can go down the line, because he's told now that he will be part of a line, and they will hopefully get him back to safety. Now, he's moved around an awful lot, as was the way. They tended not to keep the airmen in one location for any longer than was absolutely necessary. The invasion happens while all this is going on, so obviously the Germans are very busy in the area, very active. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of aircraft being shot down in the area as well. So, it's very important that he keeps moving. He spends time with a Madame Oriel at a place called Le Verger as well, another magnificent house. And he actually spends 3 weeks in hiding and on the move, masquerading as this gardener. He was a little bit shocked. He got reunited with the flight engineer and got to know the whereabouts of all the other aircrew as well, and their fates and such like. And he was a little bit alarmed to see that the photograph on his identity papers was almost identical to the photograph, in the sense that they were wearing the same suit and tie. You couldn't make that up, could you really? But they were also issued with French francs, which he noted were all sequentially numbered. So, had that, I was going to say there's some real belters in there that were quite interesting. Now, he's told he's going to move. He's taken to various different places, and ultimately he's actually driven into the centre of Paris. And he stays in a hotel called the Hotel Piccadilly, which he works out very quickly is actually a brothel, because if in doubt, apparently, if you want a safe refuge, then if you can't find a church, then find a brothel. So Stanley told me. So he's hiding out there. He said he's going to be moved on. They're going to arrange a Lysander to fly him out. He's given a mysterious package. He never quite works out what this package is, but he's given a package to take back with him. And then there's a commotion. There's a drama. Someone comes running in. There's all sorts of noise and guns being waved again, and he's told he's got to get out of there immediately. And this is clearly staged. This is all for him. And he goes downstairs, he gets in a car, the car speeds off, it makes a stop, and then it carries on. And then they come to a roadblock. And again, there's a lot of acting goes on, but it's quite clear he's actually been set up. And sure enough, he's in the hands of the Gestapo.
Gosh.
They take him to Fresnes, which is to the south of Paris. It's a notorious prison, sort of Napoleonic type prison. This is not a nice place to be. And this is the place where all of the resistance fighters, the SOE, captured agents and whatever are taken to be imprisoned and then taken off for interrogation. So this goes pretty horribly wrong for him. He's interrogated, he's taken out, he's kicked, he's beaten, he's taken away from Fresnes to a location where I'm afraid they do some pretty unspeakable things. So I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail, but if I tell you that they stubbed a cigar out on his bare chest, they're plunging his head into frozen water, they're stamping on him. I mean, this is not great. He's severely, severely hurt by this. And of course, he's just dumbstruck by what's happening to him. Just a few weeks earlier, he's having his eggs and bacon in the mess at RF Melbourne. A couple of days earlier, he's still drinking champagne and being well looked after. Not necessarily drinking champagne, but certainly being well looked after. And now he's being subjected to a level of brutality that just doesn't happen to captured RFM, and this shouldn't be happening to him. So in the prison, he's having to deal with fleas and lice, and he's in a cell that's only 10 by 7. I mean, it's tiny. They move him from cell to cell as well. He's existing on sort of watery soup, but he's classically as well spending every night waiting for the Germans to arrive, to shout "Raus, raus," tribunal, to haul him out, to give him another beating. So, I mean, this is a horrible place to be. His brief moment of respite actually comes when he's put in a cell and he hears the English language spoken for the first time. Because prior to that, he keeps getting put in cells with Frenchmen, many of whom are communists, many of whom don't like the English, don't like Churchill. So again, it's not the happiest place to be. But suddenly he hears a voice, English language. It's an Australian, and he realizes for the first time that he's actually not alone. Then comes the morning of August 15th, 1944. There's a lot of clattering and banging and shouting that's going on because the Germans know that their end is nigh at this point, and the Allies are advancing. So Stanley talks about the fact that some of the guards have been very ingratiating and what have you, but some of them have gone to a new level of abuse. But they're carted off. They're taken to the Gare l'Est in Lorries, one of the railway stations, where they're put into the sort of ubiquitous railway wagons that you would imagine, the cattle wagons, the ones that sort of says 8 horses or whatever it is, the dreadful things. But he finds himself, he's now not just one of one or two, but there's 100 or so. And in fact, there's 168 of them, Allied airmen, all in a similar position to him. And there's very approximately 80 of them are Americans, and the balance are British and Commonwealth men. So they're transported. They've got no idea where they're going. So there's hope that they might still be going to Dulag Luft to be interrogated, but the train, they see the signs for Frankfurt, that comes and goes. So they know that unfortunately that ship or that train has passed, that ship has sailed. One of the prisoners actually manages to sort of scrape his way through the floor of the cattle truck and drop down and escape, sort of straight out of von Ryan's Express. Absolutely amazing. The downside to that is obviously the Germans then get really cross at this. And so there's more beatings. A Frenchman is shot for sort of leaning out the window. He's got his hand out the window, and they stop the train, and a couple of the Allied airmen are forced to sort of bury him in a shallow grave. I mean, this is awful. But just when they think it couldn't get worse, unfortunately it does get worse, because they arrive at this railway siding, and you'll have seen clips from films, vintage films, where the cattle trucks all arrive, the people get out, and there's all the SS guards all lined up with Alsatians barking at them and they're being beaten. That is exactly what happens to these Allied airmen. So, and then they're marched off into what they then discover is Buchenwald, a concentration camp, where they're immediately processed, their heads are shaved, they're sort of deloused, and then they're sort of thrown into this area which is called the Little Camp, which is basically just an area of cobbles, and they're expected to sleep out, no shelter, no food, no blankets, no nothing, sort of no hope. So that's where they end up, and it's, as I say, it's like something they couldn't possibly imagine in their worst nightmares, and yet it's coming true for them.
Wow, it's absolutely incredible story, isn't it? And as you mentioned Buchenwald there, it's one of the most shocking parts of the story and of the book. Many listeners may have heard of the Terror Flyers, Terrorflieger before. But I wanted to ask you mentioned the 168 airmen. Could you tell us who they were, why they were denied prisoner of war status? Also, how close did they come to execution, and what role the Luftwaffe ultimately played in securing their transfer away from the concentration camp?
Yeah, sure. So, the Terrorflieger is quite interesting because it was actually a specific instruction. It was a specific order. So it wasn't, I think people tend to think that it was just a propaganda term thrown out by Joseph Goebbels to effectively describe anyone who was a bomber pilot or anyone who caused damage to the German people, buildings, etc. But actually, it dates back to something very specific in May 1944, where the Germans wanted it to be their right to execute on the spot anybody who, for example, shot up a German airman if he was bailing out or was trying to crash land his aircraft and they strafed it. And this is where it gets into the grey area. Things like if they attacked public transport trains, Well, let's face it, we're blowing up trains left, right, and centre, pre and post invasion. And then if they made attacks on civilians, so the civilians, they mean sort of farmers, workers, personal vehicles. But again, you're often strafing vehicles on a road because you don't know what it might be, etc. So this is now. There's lots of arguments go on over about a 6-8 week period over this, but they finally sort of get it down in June 1944 that what they arrive at was, okay, well, we might not just summarily execute them, but I tell you what, we're not going to allow them the legal status of prisoner of war. So you've got these airmen who remember that they were caught in escape lines. So someone like Stanley is in civilian clothes with a false identity, with false identity papers. As far as the Germans are concerned, that he's fair game. He's best. He's exactly the type of person that they can arrest and afford none of the privileges afforded by the Geneva Convention. And he's actually, so we have all of the official documentation. He is classified, as were the other prisoners, as political prisoners. And that's really important because as political prisoners, as I say, they don't have any of the rights that prisoners of war would ordinarily have. It's also a bit worse than that because he didn't realize this until after the war, but all of their papers were stamped with DIKAL, which effectively means Darf in kein anderes Lager, so allowed in no other camp. So it's basically these people are not to be transferred. QED, they are there ultimately to be executed. That's what's going to happen to them. So, and then again, lots of unspeakable things happen, including sort of forced injections. I mean, they're sitting watching. They're sitting there watching dreadful things going on all the time. You've got the classic crematorium belching out black smoke. You've got the classic sort of medical center, which no one wants to be in the medical center because you go in and you just don't come out alive. They're seeing all this stuff and they know that ultimately it could be, that's their fate as well. They see the SOE are in there. There's quite a number of special operations executive agents are in there, and they see them being marched off to their death, to their execution. So, I mean, this is not a happy place or a happy time at all. And then an extraordinary thing happens, which is really relevant to how they ended up getting out. Because the Americans decide to mount a raid, not on Buchenwald itself, but on the Gulliford, which are the munitions factories which were around Buchenwald, and which obviously the inmates of Buchenwald are providing effectively the forced labour for. So they mount an attack on the munitions facilities, but obviously some of the bombs go astray. Some of them hit the camp. There are an awful lot of casualties. And included in the casualties are the commandant, not him himself, but sorry, the commandant's wife and daughter are actually killed. Quite a lot of SS guards are killed. Obviously, many hundreds of prisoners are killed. And they fear immediate reprisals. They think they're going to be shot there and then on the spot. But actually, perversely, the Germans have a respect for the way that the British and the Allied airmen conduct themselves in terms of dealing with the wounded, in terms of sort of triaging who needs to be helped, whether they're Germans or prisoners or their own kind. And as I say, there's this really strange, grudging respect for these people. But why it's really relevant is because an incident then happens when a man called Hannes Trautloff, who's an extremely well-known German fighter, ace and leader, comes to the camp. Now, I will throw out a load of caveats here because I've read many, many versions of what happened. And unfortunately, when you try and source it, you find that everything is actually sort of second source or third source. It's somebody said somebody to something to somebody. So it's a bit tricky. But the things that we do know is that there was an underground movement within the camp, communist-led, and that we do know that a chap called Squadron Leader Phil Lamerson, who was like the leader of the Allied crews, he had a very good relationship with these guys, and he had got wind that they were due to be executed very soon. And so he wanted to get a message out, smuggle a message out. We know there was a nearby Luftwaffe base. We know that they were able to get a message out via somebody who was working at the base on a construction project. Somewhere down the line, that then coincided, or shortly after, there's a visit by Hannes Trautloff. Now, not a great one, not a great believer in coincidences. He was there ostensibly to inspect the bomb damage that had been done by the attack by the Americans. So that was like the pretext of his visit. We know that an American airman sort of called out to him in German to effectively say, you do know there's a load of Allied airmen in here. And then we do know that, 48 hours later, a party of Luftwaffe officers turn up, and very long story short, the Allied airmen are freed. And they are, as I say, it varies enormously, but they were possibly only 24 hours away from being executed. Certainly only a couple of days at very, very best. So had it not been for the timely intervention, I think there's very little doubt they actually would have been executed.
Gosh, what a story. It's just unbelievable and unimaginable, isn't it? It's just, yeah. Again, we're now going to talk about Stanley's A Fight for Recognition. This is perhaps one of the saddest aspects of his story, is that surviving the war wasn't really the end of his struggle. And when he came home, many people simply didn't believe where he'd been or what he'd endured. Why was there such reluctance, do you think, Sean, to acknowledge the experiences of the Buchenwald Airmen? And how long did Stanley spend fighting for official recognition for himself and for those who never returned?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, he basically spent all of the rest of his life fighting for recognition. And so 80 plus years he spent fighting this. I think it's even before he came home, his story was being disbelieved. So Stanley was really miffed when they finally got to Stalag 3, so in Sargon, that even the people he's sharing a hut with don't really believe him. So, and I think, there was a reluctance to believe. Now, it's important to stress that that's Stanley's view, and there are many other accounts I've read and seen where actually they say they were believed and listened to and everyone was sympathetic, but that wasn't Stanley's experience. And I think it was an unwillingness amongst the prisoners to hear about something that just didn't really fit by way of what their understanding of the Germans were. There was that slightly sort of the beastly Hun type attitude of some of the men. And to them, it was almost as though the Gestapo and the SS were like the bogeyman. So they weren't quite real unless you'd been on the receiving end. And of course, Stanley had been on the receiving end. So there was that almost, I don't want to hear it. It's almost like hear no evil, see no evil, etc. Then when he came back and he was debriefed by MI9, again, he's really quite cross because the debrief is very rushed and no one seems to want to listen to actually what happened to him, where he's been. They're just keen to know who helped him with evasion because you've got these Tedder certificates. So Sir Arthur Tedder is giving out certificates to patriotic French people and Dutch people, etc., who had helped Allied airmen to escape. So they're sort of more focused on who are we going to thank rather than actually what's really happened to you. So where that's really important is that there is therefore no record made of the abuse and the suffering that he went through. And of course, what happens is throughout his fight for recognition and compensation, they keep referring back to this report along the lines of, well, you didn't say anything at the time. But he's sort of saying, well, yeah, but I wanted to, but no one was listening to me. You wouldn't ask me and you're not recording it. You have these absolutely bizarre, I mean, there's some really bizarre things that happens that will make your hair curl. So there is a Senate report from 1945 from the Americans that actually says quite clearly that there are no prisoners of war in concentration camps. Full stop. End. Okay, so anyone turning around and saying, but I was in a concentration camp. No, you weren't, because this official report, we've got it here, says you weren't there. The British government as well are in complete denial that there's any Allied airmen, despite the fact that they knew, at least, if only from the escape from the man from the cattle truck who got back, who gave his account of what happened. They knew in 1944, in September, October 1944, they knew that Allied airmen were in this camp. It then transpires, fast forward another 20 years, that when Stanley finally leaves the RAF and he's really pursuing this with some gusto, he discovers that the International Red Cross have actually provided to the British government a full dossier, a full load of documents detailing all of the Allied airmen, their numbers, their date of arrival, their medical history, the whole bit. So the British government spend basically 80 years denying any knowledge of what Stanley could have gone through. They put all of the emphasis on Stanley to prove where he'd been. And you get this absolutely ludicrous situation where they dock his pay for the period between, I know, it would be funny if it wasn't so wrong, between June and October, because there was a reciprocal arrangement with the German authorities that, so effectively he should have received pay from the German authorities. So what the British government did was dock his pay because he said, well, you've already been paid by the Germans. He said, well, of course I haven't been paid. I was in a concentration camp. Well, not according to our records. So if you were, you're going to have to prove it. I mean, it just, as I say, it's funny, but really, really not funny. So Airman Neve, the famous Colditz escaper and later MP, he takes up Stanley's case. He can't believe this is happening to him. A figure is set aside by the British government for compensation, which they arbitrarily pick a figure of £1 million. We'll have £1 million and we'll give it out to anyone who's suffered at the hands of the Third Reich. That the Germans are going to pay. Well, they come up with this figure without any idea about how many people have actually been affected or impacted. Every time Stanley goes for a medical or whatever, they seem to sign him off as okay, even though he's got horrible things wrong with him. But unfortunately, because he's still serving as aircrew at various stages, they say, well, you're fit to fly, so don't know what your problem is. So he's struggling with that all the time. So he actually goes back into East Germany, as was then, given that he had been a spy, which I think we come to later, don't we? But he had to go back into East Germany. It's down to him. So he's traveling there when the East Germans know exactly who he is, but it's up to him to find all of the documents. And he manages, with the help of the Buchenwald authorities, or the museum there, and the help of a very kindly French lady who runs a similar type of museum, he manages to piece together and find all of the documents that give a complete audit trail from the moment he was shot down to the moment he finally got home.
I mean, I'm absolutely hanging off every word, Sean. This is just incredible. But we've got to talk a little bit about the fact that Stanley could easily have walked away after everything he'd suffered, but instead he continued serving. He flew more than 200 sorties during the Berlin airlift, later worked with British intelligence during the Cold War, and he even found himself caught up in the fallout from George Blake's betrayal. I mean, wow. How did those later chapters shape the man he became, and what do they tell us about his remarkable resilience?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Stanley flew with 62 and then 77 squadrons, Transport Command. And then he was with 206 Squadron in 1948 when the Berlin airlift came into being. And for those who don't know about the Berlin airlift, I mean, very long story short, it's the Russians sort of shut off Berlin, and the only to provide the power, the fuel, the food, etc. that the Berliners need to survive is through the air corridors, because they basically say, well, if the Russians try and close off an air corridor, that is an act of war, so they won't go that far, having shut off all the railways, the roads, etc. So he actually, as you say, does 227 sorties. So I worked that out. That's 480 hours of flying time, all in Avro Yorks. And I have to say, it's great credit to the ground crews. Big up to the ground crews, because they only on one occasion had to turn back because of mechanical fault with an engine. So that's pretty spectacular going. Wow. It was never lost on Stanley, the irony that he's helping people who just a few years before were intent on his destruction. So that never, I think that speaks volumes of the man, by the way. Yeah, he's then recruited into the intelligence services. Now, he doesn't fully realize he's being recruited into the intelligence services. And to begin with, he's in Hamburg. He's in civilian garb, but he still has a rank. He actually has a squadron leader rank at that point. And he's gathering basic information. He's running informants. It's relatively low level stuff at this point, but he obviously catches an eye and impresses to the point that he's effectively promoted to go to where it's really all happening, and that's in Berlin, as he calls it, the Argentensumpf, so the spy swamp, because they're literally falling over one another, the different intelligence services. Now, really interesting. So he does a lot more of this information gathering and running informants, but he's actually now got agents as well. He's running agents, and he's having to, he goes to places like the big refugee centers to try and recruit. But he knows who some of his counterparts are. So it's quite funny when he's there and he can see the American counterparts, the French counterparts, and even some of the East German sort of counterparts all trying to find agents, turn agents, or do what have you. But this is all, deadly serious stuff. I laugh and joke about it, but, he's sometimes disappearing in the middle of the night to try and, make a rendezvous with one of his agents who might be in trouble. He might have to get an agent out within hours. He practices with his wife and 2 daughters. They sort of practice emergency escape. He always has a vehicle fully fueled and ready to go. So, this is a dangerous place to be. He's given one specific target called Großdörn, which is an air base which they're building in eastern Germany. And the Allies are particularly interested in this because it has an abnormally long runway that they're building. And what the fear is that they are building this so that they can stick their long-range Tupolev Bear bombers, the ones that you always see in pictures from the 70s being intercepted by lightnings up in Scotland, those whoppers. Yeah. And of course, from there, they could probably reach the east coast of America. So there's a real panic on here. Why do they need a runway that's 2 and a bit miles long, if it's not for something like that? There's also special fuel that seems to be in a fuel system. So I won't tell you all that happens actually there because it's in the book, but it's quite exciting and it's very boy's own. But Stanley is the hero of the hour and then becomes the zero of the hour very quickly. So that's quite a fun story. But not only does he work on that, which is actually a major success for the Allies. So actually, when they find out what it's all about, Stanley is well praised behind the scenes, as it were, if not publicly, for his work. And he's also involved on the fringes of Operation Gold, which is a secret tunnel which they have under Berlin where they tap into the communications from the East Germans. So they're effectively listening into all the communications traffic. So they're learning a great deal. Now, that's all fine and dandy until Stanley goes back for his second tour of operations. And when he goes back, there's a big commotion in the office as he's there and people charging around and people disappearing. And that's because George Blake has just admitted back in London, I think it was, to having been a spy. And Stanley was in the office next door to George Blake. So, of course, then the dawn of realization that all of the information that they had been gleaning from the telecommunications, the Russians knew about it all along. So how much of the information were they being given was genuine? How much was false? How much had Stanley been told about various things and agents that he was running? What sort of risk were his agents at if this man that he'd worked with for all this time was actually a traitor? So you can imagine there was a huge commotion and everyone's very suspicious of Stanley, obviously, because, he was part of it. He was close with George Blake and now he's sort of back again. So that's all very, very interesting. But you said about, how did it sort of shape the man? Sort of how did he become? What did he become? His experiences in Buchenwald totally changed him from being fun-loving, a party goer and a party lover, to being sort of almost a recluse. He certainly couldn't. He didn't attend mess functions. Dining in nights were a complete anathema to him. He wanted to be on his own. So actually, his job in intelligence was perfect for him, really, because he's in the service, but he's outside of the normal sort of machinations of service life, as it were. So as I say, I think that slightly oddball existence actually suited him. He also knew what it was to be hunted, to be hounded, to be constantly under fear, in the fear that any moment now you could die. And I think, therefore, that gave him a tremendous empathy with the people that he's actually working with in East Germany and East Berlin. So, yeah, I think he had great empathy with those. But I think also it absolutely drove him to that point of needing to be understood. I do want to stress it was never about the money for Stanley. So I know we talk about compensation a lot, but compensation was really recognition. I think we need to use the word recognition. Sure, everyone needs to be compensated for what they've gone through, and it helps. But really, he was just yearning to be believed.
Now, Sean, sadly, Stanley passed away in 2025 at the remarkable age of 102. Having spent so much time researching and writing his story, what do you hope readers will take away from his life? Is this ultimately a story about Bomber Command, about survival, about justice, or perhaps something even bigger? And where can listeners find a copy of the book when it's published?
Yeah, I think what I'd like people to take away from this is that at a top level, at a really simple level, that when you think you know just about all there is to know about your subject, whichever element of the war it might be, or Bomber Command or whatever, there is always something out there that surprises you and you learn from it. So even a sort of wizened old bird like me, having done this for a better part of 40 years now, some of this was totally new and fantastic to discover. So I hope the readers actually sort of join me on that journey, if that doesn't sound too Love Island, but that sort of journey of discovery that I went through. I think as well, I want people to realize that escape and evasion wasn't, I know I've laughed and joked about some of the things that Stanley found him, positions that he found himself in, but it wasn't hello. It really wasn't. These people are really, under constant fear that they are going to get caught and what that must therefore be like. So, if it doesn't sound too sort of grand or pompous, I was thinking that I want people to know that even outwardly, if you feel defeated, there's a sort of super resilience in all of us that sometimes you just don't know you've got unless you've been really tested. So as I say, that can sound a bit pompous, but I think that's what it's about. I don't think if you'd have spoken to Stanley and said, do you think you could have done this? I think he probably would have said, I haven't got a cat and house chance. But he was a total survivor. So he survived operations. He survived being shot down. He survived being interrogated. He survived being in the camps and literally hours away from being executed. He survived that life in the shadows and thrived on it. And he sort of refused to be defeated by the bureaucrats. He never backed down from a fight and a challenge. So even though he never really got the recognition that he deserved, I sincerely hope that people reading this book will act as some sort of compensation in the broadest sense, and that they will read his story and they will therefore recognize Stanley for what he did.
And when can people get hold of the book, Sean?
Yes, indeed. So the book is out within the next few weeks. I think certainly by the end of August. If you go onto Amazon, for example, it's there already to pre-order, or contact Grub Street, the publishing house, directly. I will certainly be doing a little tour and various events and bits and pieces. And the joy of being retired now is if anyone wants me to come along, it's a local history society or whatever, and talk about Stanley's book and life and what have you, more than happy. I'm on Facebook. Get in touch with me because I love engaging. If someone's prepared to buy one of my books, I'm always prepared to have a chat with them.
That's marvellous. Well, I think we both will definitely be buying a copy of it. It sounds absolutely fantastic. Sean, thank you so much for joining us once again. I've really, really enjoyed that chat. It was brilliant.
Great stuff too. Enjoyed it too. Thanks, guys.
You're most welcome. Stanley's story is one of the most remarkable personal accounts I think we've ever discussed on the podcast. And it reminds us that for many Bomber Command veterans, the greatest battles didn't necessarily end when the shooting stopped. His courage in the air, his endurance in captivity, and his lifelong determination to seek justice leave a truly extraordinary legacy. Thank you once again, Sean, for sharing his story with us.
Yeah, that was absolutely incredible. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, everyone who's been listening today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help others discover Never Mind the Dambusters. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so for as little as £2.40 or $3 a month, helping us cover our hosting and production costs. You'll find all the details in the show notes. Don't forget, you can also join the conversation on our Facebook group or follow us across social media, where we'd love to hear your thoughts on today's discussion. We'll be back in a fortnight with another fascinating story from the history of RAF Bomber Command. But until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.
Bye, everyone. See you soon.
Hey, guys. Bye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.